Have you ever had a dream so vivid, so haunting, that it felt less like fantasy and more like a warning? Now imagine if that dream belonged not to you, but to Carl Jung, the legendary psychoanalyst who mapped the human soul like an explorer in a vast, unknown land. What if Jung, decades ago, peered into the abyss of the unconscious and saw not only the psyche of the individual, but the approaching madness of our entire civilization? What if what he saw is exactly what we're living today? In one of his private writings, Jung described a vision, not a theory, not a metaphor, a literal vision. Cities drowning beneath rising tides, people consumed by unseen forces, and the very fabric of society unraveling before his eyes. At the time, it was dismissed as a psychological episode, perhaps even a moment of instability. But as we look around now, with growing political extremism, social fragmentation, digital hysteria, and spiritual confusion, that vision no longer feels like madness. It feels like prophecy. Jung didn't just talk about individuals needing to confront their shadow. He warned that civilizations too could become possessed by their collective unconscious. That the shadow of a society, its unspoken fears, its repressed traumas, its buried contradictions, could rise up and consume everything if left unchecked. Today, as we watch irrationality becoming normalized, truth becoming fluid, and anxiety becoming a permanent state of being, we have to ask, was this the chaos Jung foresaw? This isn't just about psychology, this is about survival. It's about understanding the inner tectonics of our age before they rupture everything we've built. Jung believed that when individuals lose connection with meaning, myth, and soul, they don't become free, they become dangerous. Because nature abhors a vacuum, and where meaning is absent, madness rushes in. The question isn't whether Jung predicted today's chaos in a literal sense. The question is deeper. It's whether he uncovered a hidden code within the human psyche, one that, if ignored, would doom us to repeat the same archetypal catastrophes again and again. Floods, fires, collapse, rebirth. Patterns that echo not only through history, books, but through our dreams, our fears, our headlines. Right now, there is a war happening, not just on battlefields or in political arenas, but in the invisible realm of the psyche. A war between the conscious and the unconscious, between the known and the repressed, between order and chaos. And in that war, Jung believed, the greatest threat wasn't external. It was internal. It was the shadow we refused to face. So, what exactly did Jung say? What did he see coming? And why are his words, buried in journals and books nearly a century old, more relevant now than ever before? If you're ready to look into the mirror Jung held up to humanity, you might not like what you see. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because maybe, just maybe, he wasn't trying to predict the future. Maybe he was trying to warn us. Carl Jung didn't write like a man of his time. He wrote like someone who had stepped outside of time. Someone who had seen the entire arc of human destiny from a vantage point few dared to climb. In his later years, he spoke less like a scientist and more like a prophet. Not because he claimed divine revelation, but because he had spent a lifetime excavating the deepest strata of the human mind. And what he found there wasn't just personal. It was universal, it was ancient, and it was terrifying. In his diaries, Jung described a recurring dream that haunted him before World War I, a great sea of blood spreading across Europe, destroying everything in its path. He didn't know what it meant at the time, only that it felt real, almost inevitable. Months later, the war began. Coincidence? Maybe, but Jung didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in synchronicity, in meaningful patterns that emerge when the unconscious begins to overflow into the waking world. Jung's real fear wasn't war, though. His fear was what caused it. He believed modern man had severed his connection to myth, to spirit, to the archetypal truths that once gave life meaning. Science had explained everything, but in doing so, it had emptied everything. Rationality became a god, but a cold and soulless one. And without a living connection to something greater than himself, man became lost, prey to ideologies, mass movements, and emotional contagions that surged up from the collective unconscious like tidal waves. He watched in horror as Nazi Germany took shape, not because he was surprised, but because he had seen the archetype emerging years before. He called it possession, a state where an entire society falls under the spell of an idea, an image, a projection, and loses itself completely. The individual dissolves into the mass. Thinking is replaced by chanting. Feeling is replaced by frenzy. And behind it all, an ancient pattern plays out once again. The rise of the tyrant, the sacrifice of the scapegoat, the descent into chaos. Jung warned that these patterns were not relics of the past. They lived in us, in you, in me, in everyone. And when we deny them, repress them, pretend they don't exist, they don't disappear. They grow stronger. They wait. And when the right conditions emerge, fear, confusion, fragmentation, they rise. Not as symbols this time, but as events. Today, those conditions are everywhere. The political sphere has become mythological. Good versus evil, hero versus villain, purity versus corruption. Social media has become a ritualistic arena where identity is performed and sacrificed daily. People no longer speak to each other. They cast spells on each other, projecting inner fears onto external enemies. It's no longer about reason. It's about archetypes. The wounded child, the righteous warrior, the devouring mother, the trickster king. Jung once wrote that the world hangs by a thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. When the psyche becomes fragmented, when the individual becomes possessed by collective shadows, the world tilts toward destruction. He wasn't being poetic. He was being literal. And now, as we watch anxiety, depression, polarization, and nihilism become epidemics, it's worth asking, is the modern psyche at war with itself? We like to believe that we're advanced, that we've evolved past our primitive instincts. But Jung saw through that illusion. He knew that beneath the surface we are still mythological beings, guided by images, symbols, dreams. And when those symbols go unrecognized, they don't fade away. They erupt. He called it the return of the repressed. And he believed that modern society was setting the stage for that eruption on a massive collective scale. It's not hard to see what he meant. Look around. What happens when a generation is cut off from meaning? When institutions fail? When traditions collapse? When narratives fracture? Something rushes in to fill the void. And if that something is unconscious, if it is not integrated, not made conscious, it becomes monstrous. Jung did not believe that humanity was doomed, but he believed we were in grave danger, not from outside forces, but from the forces within us that we refuse to face. And unless we found a way to integrate the shadow, to confront our own inner chaos, that shadow would project itself outward and shape the world in its own distorted image. But how do we confront a shadow we can't see? How do we fight an enemy that lives inside our own mind? Maybe we don't. Maybe the real battle isn't to destroy the shadow, but to understand it. Carl Jung never lived to see the internet, smartphones, social media, or artificial intelligence. But in a way that now feels eerily prescient, he described their psychological consequences decades before they existed. He warned that when a society becomes too externalized, when we pour our energy into machines, into noise, into surface-level distractions, we begin to sever the connection to our own inner world. And when that connection is lost, we don't just become confused, we become possessed. Jung believed that technology, while neutral on the surface, could become dangerous if it replaced what he called the symbolic life. Human beings, he insisted, don't survive on facts alone. We need symbols. We need stories, dreams, rituals, things that anchor the soul in something deeper than algorithms and information. Without that, we become hollow, and into that hollowness, the shadow creeps. Today we live in what some call the attention economy, but Jung would have called it something else entirely, a psychic war. Every app, every notification, every scroll is a battle for your mind, Not just your thoughts, but your symbols, your fears, your unconscious drivers. Social media doesn't just sell products, it sells identity. It transforms the self into a brand, the soul into a performance. And underneath the curated images and dopamine spikes, something darker begins to grow: disconnection, comparison, envy, rage. Jung warned about this psychological split. He called it inflation, when the ego identifies with an image or persona instead of the true self. The more inflated we become, by likes, by status, by artificial success, the more brittle we become. Because the unconscious doesn't care how successful you look. It cares whether you're whole. And if you're not, it will find a way to remind you. Anxiety, depression, addiction, breakdown. These, to Jung, weren't just disorders. They were signals, messages from the psyche that something had gone deeply wrong. He wrote that every individual must one day face the night sea journey, a descent into the unknown, a confrontation with the shadow. But what happens when no one is allowed to descend? When everything is optimized for comfort, distraction, and surface pleasure? The shadow doesn't vanish, it waits, and then it manifests. Collectively, in movements, in breakdowns, in sudden bursts of violence or despair that seem to come from nowhere. Nowhere. That word, so often used to describe chaos. But to Jung, there was no such thing as nowhere. Everything came from somewhere. Every mass hysteria, every psychological epidemic, every cultural breakdown had a source, the unconscious. And the unconscious speaks in symbols. So when those symbols are denied, mocked, or ignored, they don't just disappear. They become volatile. Think about the world today. Conspiracy theories spreading like wildfire, belief systems forming overnight, mass polarization, not just in politics but in identity, meaning, and even reality itself. This isn't just about misinformation, it's about myth. Humanity is myth-making by nature, and when traditional myths collapse and aren't replaced by new, grounded ones, the unconscious begins to create its own, often through fear, through projection, through chaos. Jung believed that the death of myth was the birth of madness. Not immediately, but eventually, because the myth isn't just a story we tell, it's the architecture of the soul. It's the map by which we orient ourselves in the universe. Remove it, and we wander. Worse, we latch on to false myths, ones that divide rather than unite, that inflame rather than inspire. Ideologies masquerading as salvation, identities forged in trauma rather than truth. In his time, Jung warned that Western society had lost its spiritual compass. That science, while powerful, had become a kind of sterile religion. That rationalism alone could not satisfy the human need for meaning, and that when meaning is lost, chaos fills the vacuum. What would he say now, seeing a world obsessed with simulation, with virtuality, with endless distraction and no destination? He might say we are in the grip of an archetype, not a new one, but a very old one, the trickster, the one who deceives, who inverts truth, who thrives in confusion. Jung described the trickster as an unconscious force that erupts when structures fail, when the old gods fall and the new ones have yet to rise. The trickster laughs, mocks, distorts, and under his influence, nothing is sacred. And yet, in Jung's worldview, even the trickster had a role. Even chaos served a function. It was the dark road that could lead, eventually, to transformation. But only if we faced it consciously. Only if we recognized what was happening not just out there, but in ourselves. So we have to ask, in an age of constant connection, why do we feel so fragmented? In a world of limitless data, why do we feel so lost? Maybe it's not because we lack information. Maybe it's because we lack integration. And Jung believed that without integration, the unconscious becomes fate. And fate has no mercy for the unaware. There's a reason Carl Jung didn't just study the individual psyche. He studied civilizations, religions, myths, dreams shared across time and continents. He believed that beneath all cultures, all ideologies, all histories, there existed a shared psychic blueprint, the collective, unconscious. It is from this place that our archetypes emerge: the hero, the villain, the mother, the tyrant, the trickster, the outcast. But Jung's greatest concern wasn't with which archetypes we loved, it was with the ones we ignored. He called it the shadow, not just the dark parts of an individual, but of entire nations, entire epochs. He said the greatest threat to humanity was not nuclear weapons, not poverty, not even war itself. The greatest threat was unconsciousness, because unconsciousness blinds us to our own participation in the chaos we claim to fear. It makes us believe the enemy is always out there, never in here. It convinces us that we are awake, while we sleepwalk into disaster. The shadow doesn't knock politely. It crashes through the gates. And if we haven't prepared, if we haven't built an inner foundation strong enough to withstand its force, it devours us. That's what Jung saw in Nazi Germany. That's what he saw in Stalin's Russia. That's what he warned the modern world about. Not the rise of one particular evil, but the pattern of evil, and how it repeats when we fail to confront it within ourselves. And now we see that pattern again. Not with the same names, not with the same flags, but in spirit. The polarization, the projection, the creation of scapegoats, the collapse of dialogue into accusation, the need for an enemy, the hunger for purity. All of it, signs that the shadow is rising, not just in governments, but in hearts, in minds, in homes. But Jung didn't believe we were doomed. He believed we were asleep, and that awakening wasn't just possible, it was necessary. He called it individuation, a painful process, a heroic journey, the integration of opposites, the merging of light and shadow into a fuller, more conscious self. But it couldn't be done collectively. It had to be done individually. Each person had to choose it. Each person had to face their own darkness, rather than projecting it onto the world. In that sense, Jung wasn't just warning us, he was inviting us to look deeper, to go inward, to listen to the dreams we dismiss, the symbols we ignore, the emotions we suppress. He believed that chaos, when seen with open eyes, could become revelation, that darkness, when approached with courage, could become a portal. And yet, how many of us are willing to walk through that portal? How many of us would rather cling to false certainties, tribal identities, echo chambers, and digital masks, than do the painful work of integration? Jung didn't sugarcoat it. He knew the shadow doesn't just hide fear, it hides power. The power we've abandoned, the truths we've exiled, the soul we've forgotten. We live in a time that worships visibility, followers, views, virality. But Jung taught that the most important journey is invisible. It happens in silence, in solitude, in the moments when the ego breaks and something older, deeper, more eternal begins to speak. Not in words, but in symbols, in dreams, in suffering. And in those moments we glimpse what he called the self, the totality of who we are, not just who we appear to be. So the question is not, did Jung predict today's chaos? The question is, are we willing to listen now? If Carl Jung was right, and the chaos outside is a reflection of the chaos within, then maybe the most radical thing you can do in a collapsing world is look inward, not to escape it, but to understand it, to transform it. Because this isn't just history repeating itself. It's the unconscious rising. It's the myths demanding to be seen. And if you don't face them, they'll face you. The shadow is no longer hiding. The only question left is, are you ready to see it? Subscribe if you're ready to go deeper. The next chapter starts soon, and what's coming might just change the way you see everything.